Welcome to the Tech Founders Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Pappin. Today, I'm super excited to be talking to Niamh Fowler from Druid Learning. Niamh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to having a chat.
Let's get started with a quick introduction of yourself and your company, Druid Learning.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, my name's Niamh Fowler, and I'm the CEO of Druid Learning. Druid Learning is we basically, from a technical perspective, are an ETL solution with a generative AI output, focused on the media and publishing space. When talking to non-technical people, the kind of approach I take would be Druid Learning is an AI platform that takes historical content, turns it into an AI dataset, and then allows journalists to use predictive content generation to scale their content output. That's generally the way I kind of pose it when I'm not really talking to technical people. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And what's the current state of the business and any sort of metrics that you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah. So, Druid Learning has just turned 5 years old. I started the business in kind of the COVID era, and I was very much focused at that time on fixing a COVID problem. And one of the co-founders in the business, Hillary, was basically a teacher at the time. She worked a lot with publishers, kind of generating specific books and material for publishers for them to produce commercially. And she approached me kind of saying that, like, in her class, a lot of the kind of weaker students were falling behind because of the move from classroom-based learning to tablet-based learning. And she was kind of concerned because from her experience working with educational publishers, like, one of the big issues that was being kind of faced, I suppose, was the fact that all of their content was not necessarily compatible to delivery on a tablet device. So at that point, I kind of worked with her. I was still working I was working professionally in a large international retailer. As a technical product manager. And sort of in my spare time, developed this tool that was basically a large content management tool that itemized and kind of flipped content into essentially individual assets. And we created a GUI for delivery on tablet devices with accessibility options available to students. So it was kind of like an odd starting to the journey, but once COVID finished, when I left the job and kind of went into sort of freelancing, I focused my time on the business, and basically from there got some European funding, some European Horizon funding to put into the product to change it into what it is now. So we pivoted slightly. But really, we kind of focused on large content data sets. And, like, instead of now creating a GUI for accessibility purposes on tablet devices, we now allow for predictive content generation using the historical assets as a base on which content is generated. So that's kind of a very kind of convoluted way of saying we started out doing one thing, pivoted slightly into doing something else, and as of this year, we're revenue generating, and we kind of have a number of international and national clients. So yeah, we're excited about where we're going. As of kind of year to date, we have 150,000 in revenue, kind of 75,000 of that is ARR already. So we're kind of beginning to focus on flipping our initial design partners into kind of basically license-based contracts. So kind of our focus for next year has been, like, from building the product this year into kind of selling what would be classified as an enterprise level product. But obviously we still have a bit of development to do on it. So yeah, it's going well so far. Like, as of kind of this year, again, we've generated or investment wise, we've essentially accumulated a combined amount of about 750,000. And we aren't actively looking for investment at the moment, but we will open a round probably at the end of Q1 next year. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on becoming revenue generating. That's a humongous milestone. And so the team is yourself as the CEO, Hillary is your co-founder, And is there anyone else working with you guys
Yeah, so
or?
there's kind of three people. So at the moment, we have myself and Hillary who are full time employees, and then we have three kind of contractors, but essentially they're full time contractors. We are hoping to bring them in full time into the business kind of after we raise. But we have them as contractors just from a cash flow perspective, but they're basically working 40 hours a week. So we have Jatin, who is our CTO, who was actually a mentor on the Textiles program, and who subsequently came into the business. And then we have Grace, who is our chief data scientist, and we have Calvin, who is he's kind of our everything person. So he has great experience in setting up IT systems in third party clients. So we took him on board essentially to help us basically implement our solution in our clients' organizations. And when he's not doing that, he's helping our IT teams to sort of like manage the roadmap that we have. So we use sort of contractors for development as well as developing ourselves internally. So he helps us manage kind of both those situations.
Awesome. I'd like to go back for a second and talk about that initial pivot that you
Yep.
guys did. So you're working with schools back then, and then there was the pivot kind of post-COVID. Can you dive into what led you to that pivot and then also how that helped determine your current business model now?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I suppose we were fortunate enough to be revenue generating pretty much immediately when we were obviously fixing a very specific COVID problem. And we were working not only with schools, but we were working with educational publishers. I suppose for us, the key was that we were essentially bridging the gap between like what the actual schools needed and kids needed and kind of their often historical archives, which were like, EPUB files and, PDFs and just like really what I would call rigid file types. And so when we were dealing with educational publishers, we developed quite a good relationship with them because they were very much reliant on us to helping them solve this issue. And so we used that as an opportunity to sort of really understand not only the problem we were fixing, but some of the actual underlying issues within their businesses. And so when COVID finished, one of the biggest things, of course, was, well, if you're solving a COVID problem, the problem goes away when COVID ends. So we used the revenue we had already generated to kind of begin to pivot the product. And we had known and we had experienced through our relationships with the educational publishers, we understood sort of, I guess, what the underlying problem was. And that was obviously unstructured data or unstructured files that was sitting on their databases. So when we began to sort of pivot, I had reached out to a number of what I would classify as like sister industries, so news outlets, media outlets, and basically kind of began to I suppose probe and see if this was an existing problem in those organizations too. And kind of it became quite clear that it was. And then we were fortunate enough to get onto that European Horizon program, which is called Stadium, which was a news and media focused like accelerator. And really from there, we kind of we got EU grant funding to 150,000. And we used that plus the revenue we had generated to pivot into fixing kind of the unstructured file issue in those organizations. And that led us on a path to get to where we are. So that pivot very much came from having built the relationships with publishers and then kind of doing, a bit of client research at the point when we decided to put our hard-earned money into building a kind of like an adjacent product. I would we use a lot of the base code, but we had to change a lot of it. So yeah, it was a journey, but I'm really glad we did it. I mean, it meant that we were kind of not revenue generating for almost 2 years, which was quite scary. But kind of we've managed to sort of get a product now with a good number of design partners to a point where we could potentially sell like license-based agreements without potential pilots, which is the hope for next year.
Awesome. Can we walk through exactly if a journalist or a publisher comes in to work with you
Yeah.
guys, how that relationship would start, what service
Yeah.
that Druid Learning is performing and then what the output is, just so we can really put together exactly
What it is.
how the
Yeah.
business, what it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the really interesting things is that actually when we were developing the product, we realized quite quickly that we would have to, if we wanted to sell into a news organization, for example, we had to provide a beneficial output in their view, right? So we knew that we were going to be able to create an AI ready data set in their organizations that they could then use in other AI applications, for example. But if you talk to journalists about that, they're like, what? So we knew that we had to allow, like, whatever we did, we had to have an additional benefit. So in our view, we were like, okay, well, with what we're doing, we can increase content output and reduce the amount of time that somebody takes to write an article. So I'll talk about a specific example with a client that we have. So a client of ours kind of approached us to say, look, we want to increase the number of content files, or we want to increase the number of articles we create on a daily basis, because if we're able to publish more content, we get more commercial ad revenue. And then we kind of, and the problem right now is that, like, you know, a lot of our journalists will either spend ages like searching for content that we already have to use it as a starting point, instead of starting like creating an article from a blank page, right? So when they approached us, they were like, we don't necessarily want to use generative AI, even with sort of like private versions of these like public models. So like, you know, there's still a lot of concern in what I would call the content industries about who owns commercially, like who commercially owns content generated from these tools, right? So you take OpenAI as an example in ChatGPT. So we said as a starting point, look, we'll take 5 years of your content and we'll actually process that and we'll label and annotate that entire, like that entire kind of 5 years of data or content. And what we'll do is we'll also kind of like highlight and kind of just through our annotation process, kind of allow you to kind of get to a deeper level of insight into what your content is, and kind of like, you know, see the trends within your content, blah, blah, blah. And then I said that from there, one of the things that we can do is, as your journalists are writing in your authoring tool, we can actually allow, you know, through basically a plugin, we can allow those we can allow those journalists to start writing a content article about, I don't know, let's just say Meghan Markle. And if they start writing about Meghan Markle on holidays, and then suddenly they see paragraphs that are like, that kind of are grounded in the content that they've developed about Meghan Markle on holidays last year, and they're able to see that Meghan Markle has been on holidays twice this year, and they're able to click on that article or click on that paragraph and put it into their newly created article. And so what we're doing is we're essentially allowing the editor to and the journalist to still edit the content, but we're delivering them content that's based and grounded in the facts of their organization and in the style and tone of voice of that organization. And the reason we know what the style and tone of voice is because we've already gone through and labeled and annotated that content for 5 years. So that's the idea. It's sort of like like I said, it's sort of like an ETL solution that gives us a huge amount of insight and intelligence into the style, tone of voice, editorial perspectives of organizations. And then that flows into us allowing journalists to either create new, or publishers to create new books, material, and start at like 80% or start at 50% rather than starting with a blank page. And that's really the key. And that's why we're able to reduce production timelines. And that's why we're able to increase that out. So going back to the organization that I work with, we were able to increase their content output daily by 33%. Because it was very simple. We just reduced the amount of time people spent creating new articles by 10 minutes a day, like by 10 minutes every article. So it was quite, you know, it seems quite like basic, but actually, you know, in comparison to competitors, we are able to deliver high quality material because we've already done the ETL process.
That's very interesting. And the journalists access it through a plugin on the website where they can scan
Yeah,
the
so
database.
it actually depends
essentially.
on the tier that they've opted into. So if you're an enterprise client, we offer that solution. If you're a client with like not very many articles or files, or we actually have an interface that people can use to just upload maybe like 20 files themselves, and then they can go through the same process, but that's done through our user interface. So it's very much like dependent on the tier at which their license is. But yeah, for the bigger organizations, it's like because a lot of authoring tools will either be custom built by the organization or will be sort of like, a WordPress type situation. So it's kind of what we needed was the ability to sort of like via an API just like deliver content in whatever format or whatever application they were using. Yeah.
Very interesting. I have a friend who writes articles for a crypto news
Oh,
publication,
cool.
and it makes the connection right now because he gets paid on the amount of articles he
Yeah.
produces a day.
Yep.
So his job is write 4 or 5 articles a day. And for somebody who's dabbled in blogging before, that seems like an insane amount of
Absolutely.
content to
Every
produce
day.
in a day.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah. But I can, using that as a reference and how he's talked to me about his job, I could make the connection.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
By having that data easily accessible, especially referencing, I would assume since it's the organization's previous articles
Exactly.
as well, they trust those sources
Exactly.
implicitly
And then
because
what we do is we allow them to see where that information is coming from. So if they want to fact check themselves, they can. So that's the idea. It's sort of like and then also the reason why they seem to be engaged with us is because they like the fact that it's their content. And like these people, like, if you think about the New York Times, they're publishing like hundreds of articles every day. You multiply that by a factor of like 50 years and you're dealing with some serious amounts of data. So it's sort of like, or content files, which are waiting to be turned into data. So it's like, so it's quite an interesting concept. And especially in what I would classify as content heavy industries. So not just media, not just publishing, not just newsroom. You then think about things like consultancy company, like management consultants, marketing agencies, that type of thing, where, a lot of their content is like commercial property and proprietary property. And I think that's where, you know, we see our fit. It's like dealing with those companies who are still making a lot of money from their content, but how we can essentially build in efficiency into that is really the key. And how we build in efficiency is by allowing them to rely on their historical stuff that has gone before, plus that a human oversight and input that will allow them to create something new as well. So,
it seems like if I'm working for a news organization, being able to access data faster
yeah,
is a
yeah,
no-brainer because it allows me to do my job
yeah.
faster. But the world isn't as black and white. So what sort of pushback have you heard as you're going into these conversations and as you're pitching this to
Um,
potential customers?
we tend to like it depends on the organization. We're also working with we're working with a large research organization like specializing in cancer research actually at the moment. And part of it is that the output of that organization is research papers. And they have huge amounts of data and they have huge amounts of papers and they have no standardization across their labels. They have no standardization across their hierarchies or tags. And the pushback we got from them was like, well, how can you standardize the approach? And I'm like, well, you can always standardize the approach. You can always, and it's not that you have to standardize, but you have to at least structure the way that you label, right? So or annotate at least. And so what we did was kind of with them, and we kind of said, okay, well, let's workshop this, right? You think that there's no way that we can standardize? Okay, cool, let's workshop. And then we did. We went into a 3-hour workshop, and suddenly, what do you know? It's like suddenly there is a standard thing that's like present across all of these different files. It was kind of it's one of those things where sometimes people just think it's too much of a task. And like for us, we automate the whole process, right? So we automate the annotating, labeling, and vectorizing. So what we actually do is we say, okay, well, you know your content the best, right? If you don't have specific if you don't have specific things you want to label, give us the broad topics. Like, for example, with that organization I mentioned, they had something where, they had like years and years and years of historical, very local content. And one of the things that they said was like, I don't know what we can do. And I was like, just, let's talk it through. And it became quite quick, quite apparent quite quickly that, you know, their articles were broken out into like lifestyle pieces, sports pieces, blah. And so at least you have then a parameter, and then that helps a lot anyway. And then you can, because our tool assesses the actual content of files as well as like in order to label. We were able to sort of like not only create some sort of framework and structure against which they could like search, because we have semantic search, but like we were able to offer them like at least sort of a way against which they should see their own content. And like this is the thing, like a lot of these organizations don't really know what they have in their content files. Like they don't, like they have, you know, like some of the educational publishers we work with, like they've been around for hundreds of years and they're like, well, we don't really know, like we have these OCR files and like blah blah blah. And you're just like, okay, well, just hand them over to us and you'll see what you have. And then often they find that actually the idea of reusing material plus an overlay of generative AI focused on a particular audience, well then, you know, Bob's your uncle. You don't have to, you're not necessarily again creating from scratch, but you're also relying and reusing some of the content they've gone before. So yeah, it's a really interesting area. And like kind of my exposure to it was partly because of that the starting point of the product. But also I worked in Amazon in their digital media area. So I was like looking after sort of Prime Music, Prime Video, that type of it. So I was aware that this kind of content stuff is like a bit of a mess. And it was kind of, yeah, it's sort of when you think about it, there was really no need for structured archival content. Whereas now in the era of AI, there's a huge need to kind of transform that into usable data, which can obviously, you know, impact your bottom line.
Yeah, I think in comparison to the like OpenAI and those models where they've scraped the internet, they do have a lot of data there, but it's vastly different than what we're talking about
Yeah.
here because that's publicly
Yeah.
available. And I'm sure these companies, one, their data is not publicly
Yeah.
available. Two, they don't want it to be, but they need a way to organize that. And as you mentioned, if they've been around for 20, 30, 100 years, there's a whole bunch of data there. That's kind of almost like a gold
Yeah.
mine that's sitting there
Yeah.
that's been built up over a long amount of
And
time.
that's in my pitch. I kind of say, look, they're sitting on a gold mine of assets. And, you know, in the future, and this is something where, you know, obviously we don't own or claim any ownership over their files, their content or whatever. But in the future, when the data wall is ultimately hit, you know, they have, you know, archives from the 50s, 60s, you know, that are potentially training data that can be kind of packaged and sold to large organizations. So like the kind of, you know, LLMs operators. So, you know, there's a lot of potential commercial relevancy to what we're doing in those organizations. And depending on the type of organization and the resources in that organization, people are already thinking about this, or in some cases they aren't, because, you know, just the maturity around AI is so vastly different in different organizations.
Yeah. In terms of the technical complexity of actually implementing this within the organization, obviously there's one in the example that you gave, which is explaining to the organization, hey, we can structure the
Yeah.
data. And that's a human to human objection. But in terms of technically being able to get this data that could vary immensely depending on the amount of content that organization has, what are some of the challenges that have you found there in order to get that to a place where people within the organization could use it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be honest, we have the biggest issues we've come across is when something is semi-structured. So what I mean by that is we were dealing with quite a large database of content recently, and they had some decent metadata around their assets, but it was all wildly different, right? So essentially, what we ended up having to do was like almost like um take a step further back and kind of say, okay, well, what do they have? What do we have to supplement? It was like that gap analysis. Like it was essentially a gap analysis that we had to do. And, you know, normally this process is quite straightforward and streamlined, right? Like we just go in, often we're dealing with completely unstructured data, and it's actually easier for us to deal with that. Whereas when, you know, the issue is when it is semi-structured and you're kind of then trying to like identify the gaps so that you can fill it in. And that's really the the main challenge that we've kind of encountered. And I think it's not unusual, and I don't think I think we're going to encounter it again. So it was a good challenge for us to sort of work out a good process around kind of that situation. If we receive files that have some metadata attached to it, and then we have to go in and annotate and label and add to the metadata, we kind of essentially have to implement a step that says review what there is, match against what is expected, and then fill in the gap and look up this resource if you are. So it was kind of like we did have to have we had to build in certain logic to deal with that, to, essentially to deal with that.
How do you work with businesses, kind of working backwards from we have all this data, we've gone through the process of being able or understanding at
Yeah.
least a plan of how we can structure
Yeah.
it. How do you then tie that back to presenting the data to these businesses in the best way that serves them?
Yeah, so we actually have I mean, one of the easiest things that we did was we developed an interface where people could just search across their assets, and it was literally a search bar, and then they could see all of their info. It was and we were able to say, well, look, this is all your stuff. Like it's, we've already annotated, we've already labeled it. Like you go in and have a look, and one of the people that were chasing moment is they wanted to potentially use us to enable deep research into just to facilitate documentary output or documentary filmmaking. And one of the biggest things that we were going to do was to kind of say, okay, well, if you want us to do that, you have to work with us, because right now the interface very it's so easy. It's just like a search bar, and and then you crawl back everything, or you can get a file, audio file, video, whatever, podcast, whatever it might be. So it's very that's how we're and it's been useful for us because we can immediately show them the value we're adding. But really for them, kind of specifically the organizations we're targeting, it's the idea of the content output. That's really the kind of clincher. But yeah, that's sort of the immediate benefit is something, and it's good for us because as we're implementing, we're able to kind of immediately deliver something that's adding value. Because it often takes a bit of time to work out what their authoring tools are, ensure that our API is able to, it's just, and in some cases there are custom built tools. So you kind of have to, it in some cases implementation may be maybe 2 months or 1 month or whatever, depending on the tools that they're using. So for us, it's good to be able to show immediate benefit after we process those files and we say, hey, why don't you go and have a look and, mess around. And in another world outside of AI, that would have just been a data asset management tool. But and it still is, but we don't necessarily call it that. They're able to go in, search across their assets, search across their archives, semantic search stuff. It's just lady in blue coat or whatever, and they're able to get whatever they want back. So it's good. It's I think it's beneficial for us, especially as we are earlier in our growth stage. So, working with larger organizations to be able to say that we've delivered something within a week it adds to our credibility.
You mentioned to me before the show, you guys recently had a new product update.
Yeah.
Do you want to dive into that and what that was?
Yeah. So we actually, I mentioned to you before that we have the capability now of if a company has only 20 files or maybe 14 files, we're actually able to offer them the same solution in terms of content generation to 80%, and then they're able to kind of go off and develop new stuff. So what we wanted to do was focus on allowing the same benefits for smaller organizations. And the reason why was because, a lot of smaller companies had approached us, and we wanted to offer them a kind of a solution that was less expensive, but still had the same output and benefit. And I think that was the latest update. It was we had been working on it for a while, but we were able to actually make it work to a good high quality degree. So we kind of released that, and we now have a client who's working and using it, not paying a lot of money to us, but we're happy enough to get their feedback and just see what they think about it. So yeah, so it was very exciting because like previously our generator tool was based on like we needed a huge amount of data to make it appropriate and work. Whereas like that was a big win for us, that like now all we need is like a couple of files. We still do the ETL process in the background, but it's like we're able to like appropriately parse a lot of the like, so we added in a step that basically said, what topic do you want to cover, and it will be like, let's say space and planet Earth and space. And that was the step that we were missing now, like, and essentially that planet Earth and space would be crawled. Basically, we would look at all those 20 files, see what info there was about planet Earth and space, draw that back and say, do you want to use this, and generate other stuff? And if you want to generate other stuff, give us context. And so that was sort of the trick. It was sort of like we realized that actually we don't need large huge data sets in order to allow for the same sort of approach. It just means that we would have to like scale, like we would have to kind of scale up and down the generative amount depending on if there was actual available information. So that was the biggest thing for us.
Awesome. It's amazing that you have some early champions who are using the
Yeah.
new product.
Yeah. Hopefully, like, long may they continue. So yeah, it's been good.
Let's dive into your experience raising money and at Techstars and then the European
Yeah.
funds. What was that experience like? Any sort of thoughts and reflections that you have after going through that process?
Yeah. So for me, Techstars was amazing. The reason why was because, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not based. Well, then I was not based in the US. Now I am. But I needed a way to almost Americanize my business. And what I mean by that is the way you approach investment funding in Europe is very different to the way you approach investment funding in the US. The way you tell your story is very different. It's like chalk and cheese. And what I needed when I did the Techstars program, it was the Global AI Techstars program, that what they gave me was a good framework against which I could essentially Americanize my business. And I don't know the better way to phrase it, but it gave me a sense for how to answer specific questions, especially like you guys focus more on the ratios and things like that. Like, whereas in Europe, they actually talk about figures in your spreadsheet. Like, there were just differences where, unless I was actually put in like an investor situation without necessarily having done any of that Techstars program, I would have been totally out of my depth. And I think that's where Techstars was really valuable. They helped create a narrative that worked in the US. And I think that was the biggest thing that they gave me. And then you mentioned the European program. So that European program was what they call a Horizon funded program. So Horizon is like a $25 billion initiative put into research, development, and innovation across Europe. And I was lucky enough to get onto one of the programs, and I got like, 150,000 in grants funding. So no equity, no nothing taken. And that really allowed us, to be honest, I don't think, unlike the US at that time, I wasn't really like, there wasn't really a huge amount of funding to put into businesses that were pre-revenue. And Europe isn't really a fan of putting money into pre-revenue businesses, as opposed to the US, where they'll just give you money. So it was kind of really useful for us because we needed money at the time in order to help us pivot that product. So I think for me, like, investment wise, so far, to like, we've been successful. We had some early backers in the business who've stuck with us, high net worths that I had met through various events. And I got two high net worths who have been able to kind of like contribute to funding requirements, like across the 3 years when we weren't making, well, 2 years that we weren't making money. And now, kind of, I mentioned that we're looking to raise at the end of Q1, and that's really going to be our first official institutional raise. So excited about it, partly because if we can convert some of the design partners that we had this year into longer term ARR, I mean, that makes the conversation with investors so much easier. And I think we want to be in a good position where we aren't out for a long time trying to raise. Like, I want to focus on growing the business commercially this year. Like, I want to build us into a growth stage business, not just a startup. And so I don't necessarily want to spend all my time raising money, even though I know that's obviously my job. But, the revenue we've generated so far has been positive, and I know that we have a pipeline of like 1.5 million. So it's like how I kind of want to focus on conversion. But the investor, like I'm back over in Ireland just for the holidays, had some really good investor conversations. I was used to having US investor conversations, which when I walked into having some of the recent conversations, because I've been sort of like preempting this raise and kind of building relationships with investors in anticipation for the raise. Yeah, it was just I was like, oh, I forgot how different they were. European investors, just for anybody listening who might be interested in the two main differences between European and US investors, in my experience, I'm pre-seed, and I'm raising on a pre-money valuation, which we'll see if that's going to stand or fly next year, but we'll see. Even though I'm revenue generating, we'll see. But like the biggest difference is that the appetite towards risk is very different. So a European investor, like certainly the ones that I was talking to recently, European investor will want a Series A level risk associated with your business if they are investing at pre-seed, especially if they're investing pre-seed at maybe a 1 million like check size. Whereas obviously in the US, the appetite towards risk is okay, you're showing good traction. We believe that we understand that you have to, kind of do a bit of trial and error to get to where you need to go to be profitable and to be that kind of unicorn. So the I suppose the level of risk associated with businesses and the assessment of risk is very different. The second thing I would say is that it's more relationship based in Europe. So I mentioned the investors that I have already. I met them through an event. They're European based. I met them through an event and we just really hit it off. And we kind of had a number of conversations and then they were investing in the business. So it's very much a more personal one-to-one sort of like, I like your vibe situation in Europe rather than in the States. And I think there's pros and cons to that. I mean, you have more grace with people that you get on with. But, the US investors they know what they're doing. And when you have them on your kind of cap table, they bring a certain amount of sophistication and professionalism. And so you have to sort of like raise your standard as a business owner and an entrepreneur. Whereas in Europe, they're kind of like, it's, despite having a higher tolerance to risk, or a lower tolerance, no, a higher tolerance to risk, they do kind of let you just get on with it. Whereas because the US put bigger amounts in, they're kind of more dictatorial about what they want. So look, we'll see. I mean, it's like for me, I'm intending on raising in the US, with probably like follow-on support from Europe, particularly Enterprise Ireland, which is a semi-state government body here. If I can raise, even like 500,000, for example, they'll match fund that amount. So they have some good initiatives and good incentives. So I don't think I'll be raising only in the US. I think there will be contribution from Europe.
Awesome. It's really interesting to think of the cultural differences. Even being a
Yeah.
Canadian and now working with a US company, I can see how they structure the
Yeah.
business, how people work,
Yeah.
also the just kind of the internal fire
Yeah.
with some
Yeah.
people compared to the two.
Yeah.
It's a lot different, even from Canada
Yeah.
to the United
And
States.
even just like the communication style, like in New York, they're like, what do you want? Like, and they're just there, but they will give you a straight answer immediately. Whereas, in Europe, you tend to get what they call the long no, which is like, oh, and but, and if, and what, it's just like, give me a straight answer. It's just like, just give me a straight answer. Don't waste my time. I don't want to waste yours. It's just like no nonsense. And maybe that's because I've been living in New York for, the past year and a half, but like, I much rather that approach, and I much rather direct communication. And because I value people's time, I don't want to mess around and if there's no intention of investing or if there's no intention of buying, well, that's okay. I don't take it personally. Let's just move on. It's the US way is a lot more, I don't know, refreshing.
Yeah. It's almost once you get over that hump of it's not personal.
Yeah.
It's just, this is
Exactly.
how it
Yeah.
is. It's okay. And we can move
Yeah.
on with our lives.
Yeah. and let's keep a relationship because you may come back around, which is what happened to one of our clients, you know. So yeah, it is what it is.
Awesome. Niamh, as we start to wind down here, I have a question for you about reflecting on your journey as an entrepreneur up to this point. Obviously, these are things that will change. If I ask you the same question a year or two from now, it will be a new answer.
Yeah.
But if you had to look back at from where you started to where you're at now, what's the number one piece of advice that you would give to your past self?
Um, Ignore the commentary. So people have a lot of opinions and they don't necessarily have insight. And so you kind of like in the initial stages, I didn't really have the confidence to back my own, like not decisions is the wrong word. I didn't have the confidence to back my own gut instinct. And then I soon realized that actually I know the business the best and I also know the clients the best. And like people always have opinions. I would say my earlier self, I would say just go with your gut and, you know, stand true. You know, don't listen to other people who have opinions that are coming from somewhere else, you know. So that would be the number one piece of advice.
Awesome, Niamh. And where can people go online to learn more about you and learn more about Druid
Yeah.
Learning?
So if you want to learn more about me personally, my LinkedIn profile is the best. It's like /Niamh Fowler. And if you want to learn more about Druid Learning, it's www.druidlearning.com. And it's, if you look it up, DRUIDLEAORNING. That's it.
Awesome, Niamh. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so
Likewise.
much for
Thanks for
coming on the
having me.
show.
It's a great chat.